The old blue Honda coughed and wheezed as Margaret Rodriguez pulled into the service entrance of the Blackwood estate. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, looking up at the massive house through her cracked windshield. Even after working here for 8 months, the size of this place still amazed her. The main house looked like something from a movie, with its tall white columns and perfectly trimmed hedges that probably cost more to maintain than most people made in a year. Margaret checked the time on her phone. 6:30 exactly. She always arrived right on time, never early, never late. In her world, being reliable was everything. She grabbed her worn canvas bag from the passenger seat, the one that held her cleaning supplies and a thermos of coffee that would have to last her through the night shift. The bag had seen better days, just like everything else in her life, but it still did the job. The evening air was cool as she walked toward the back entrance. Fall was coming to the wealthy neighborhood of Millbrook Heights, and the trees were just starting to change colors. Margaret had always loved this time of year, but these days she barely had time to notice the seasons changing. Between her 3 cleaning jobs and taking care of her daughter Isabella, life had become a blur of work and worry. She used her key to enter through the service door, the one that led directly to the kitchen. The Blackwoods had made it very clear from day one that she was to use this entrance only. The front door was for family and their important guests, not for the help. Margaret had learned not to take these things personally anymore. After losing everything 3 years ago, she had developed thick skin about a lot of things. The kitchen was enormous, bigger than the entire apartment she shared with Isabella. Everything was spotless white marble and shining stainless steel. Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned once that they had spent more on this kitchen renovation than most people spent on their entire homes. Margaret believed it. She had cleaned enough wealthy homes to know that money changed how people saw the world, and not always in good ways. She tied her long dark hair back with a simple rubber band and put on the plain gray uniform that all the cleaning staff were required to wear. The Blackwoods employed several people to keep their home perfect, but Margaret worked the evening shift alone. She preferred it that way. Less drama, less politics between the staff, and she could work at her own pace while listening to music. Through her small EARBUDS. Margaret had developed a routine over the months. She always started with the main living areas on the first floor, then worked her way up to the bedrooms and offices on the second floor. The Blackwoods were usually out for dinner or entertaining somewhere else during her shift, which made the work easier. When they were home, she had to move around them like a ghost, cleaning without disturbing their conversations or television watching. Tonight felt different, though. As she wheeled her cleaning cart through the hallway, she could hear voices coming from the dining room. It sounded like they were having people over, which meant she would need to be extra careful to stay out of sight. The last thing she wanted was to accidentally interrupt some important business dinner. She decided to start with the main salon, the large formal room that Mrs. Blackwood used to impress visitors. Margaret pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. This room always took her breath away, even though she cleaned it twice a week. The ceiling was incredibly high, with a crystal chandelier that sparkled like diamonds. Expensive paintings hung on the walls, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. But what always caught her attention was the piano. The huge black Steinway grand piano sat in the center of the room like a sleeping giant. Its surface was so polished that it reflected the chandelier above like a dark mirror. Margaret had been told to dust it carefully, but never to open it or touch the keys. Mrs. Blackwood had been very specific about that rule every time Margaret cleaned. This room, she found herself staring at that piano. She wondered if anyone in the family actually played it, or if it was just another expensive decoration. In all her months working here, she had never heard a single note come from it. That seemed like such a waste. A piano was meant to make music, not just look pretty. She started dusting the furniture, working methodically around the room. The voices from the dining room were getting louder and more animated. She could hear Mr. Blackwood's booming laugh echoing through the house. Richard Blackwood was the kind of man who never spoke quietly. Everything about him was big and loud, from his voice to his personality to his opinions about everything. Margaret had only spoken to him a few times since she started working here. He was the type of wealthy man who looked right through people like her, as if they were invisible. She was just part of the house, like the furniture or the paintings on the walls. Sometimes she wondered if he even remembered her name, or if she was just the cleaning lady to him. She moved closer to the piano to dust its legs and bench. Up close, she could see the craftsmanship that went into making this instrument. Every detail was perfect, from the smooth curves of its body to the way the keys caught the light when she lifted the cover slightly to dust underneath. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, remembering a different time, a different life. Margaret quickly pushed those thoughts away and focused on her work. Remembering the past only made the present harder to bear. She had learned to live in the moment, to focus on what needed to be done today instead of dwelling on what used to be, or worrying too much about tomorrow. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. Someone was coming toward the salon. She quickly moved away from the piano and grabbed her dust cloth, pretending to be busy cleaning a side table. The doors opened and Mrs. Blackwood walked in with two other women, all of them dressed in expensive evening clothes and carrying wine glasses. "And this is our music room," Mrs. Blackwood was saying in her refined accent. "Richard insisted on the Steinway, even though none of us actually play. But it does make quite a statement, don't you think?" The other women murmured their agreement, admiring the piano like it was a piece of art instead of an instrument. Margaret continued dusting, making herself as invisible as possible. Years of working in wealthy homes had taught her how to blend into the background when the family had guests. "It's absolutely gorgeous," one of the women said. "I keep telling my husband we need a piano for our new house, but he thinks it's a waste since little Catherine only plays violin." Margaret finished with the side table and quietly moved her cart toward the door. She would come back to finish this room later, after the guests had moved on to whatever was next on their evening's entertainment. As she reached for the door handle, she heard Mrs. Blackwood laugh. "Oh, Richard always says that culture is something you display, not something you actually use. The piano looks wonderful, and that's what matters." Margaret slipped out of the room and closed the doors softly behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, thinking about what Mrs. Blackwood had just said. Culture as display, not use. A piano that never sang. A beautiful instrument reduced to expensive furniture. She shook her head and pushed her cart toward the next room. There was still a lot of work to do before her shift ended, and thinking about the waste of that silent piano would not help her finish any faster. By 7:30, the Blackwood mansion was buzzing with activity. Margaret could hear car doors slamming in the circular driveway as expensive vehicles dropped off guests for the evening's dinner party. She stayed on the second floor, working quietly in the guest bedrooms while the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted up from below. This was clearly one of Richard Blackwood's important business dinners. Margaret had cleaned up after enough of these events to recognize the pattern. The catering staff had arrived earlier with boxes of gourmet food. The florist had delivered elaborate arrangements, and Mrs. Blackwood had spent the afternoon directing everyone to make sure every detail was perfect. Through the upstairs windows, Margaret could see the valet parking attendants directing a parade of luxury cars. BMW, Mercedes, Tesla, Porsche. Each car probably cost more than she would make in 5 years, but in this neighborhood, they were just normal Tuesday night transportation. Around 8 o'clock, Mrs. Blackwood's voice echoed through the house intercom system. "Margaret, we need You downstairs to help serve drinks and clear plates during dinner. Please come to the kitchen immediately." Margaret sighed and put down her vacuum cleaner. This was not unusual, but it always made her nervous. Working around the family's guests required a different kind of invisibility. She had to be helpful without being noticed, efficient without being intrusive. Rich people had a talent for making service staff feel like furniture that could move and think. She made her way down the back staircase to the kitchen, where the catering manager was directing a small army of servers. The kitchen looked like controlled chaos, with people carrying trays of appetizers and opening bottles of wine that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. "You must be Margaret," said the catering manager, a thin woman with perfectly styled hair who looked like she had never cleaned anything in her life. "I'm Patricia. We need you to circulate with drinks and make sure the dining room stays tidy. Just stay in the background and keep everything flowing smoothly." Margaret nodded and accepted a tray of wine glasses filled with what looked like very expensive red wine. She had learned over the months that the Blackwoods only served the best of everything when they wanted to impress people. Tonight's dinner was clearly about business, which meant everything had to be perfect. She pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room and immediately felt the energy of the party. 8 couples were seated around the enormous mahogany table, all dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's cars. The conversation was loud and animated, filled with the kind of confidence that only came with serious money. Richard Blackwood sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. He was a large man with silver hair and a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the room. Tonight he was wearing a suit that probably cost $5,000, and he had the satisfied look of someone who owned the world and wanted everyone to know it. The deal with the Singapore investors should close next month, he was saying to the man sitting next to him. $40 million just like that. Sometimes I amaze even myself with how easy it is to make money when you know the right people. Margaret moved quietly around the table, refilling wine glasses and removing empty appetizer plates. The guests barely glanced at her, treating her like she was part of the furniture. She had become an expert at being invisible while still doing her job efficiently. The conversation bounced between topics that all seemed to revolve around money and status. Stock investments, vacation homes in the Hamptons, private jets, exclusive country clubs. These people lived in a world where spending $50,000 on a weekend trip was considered normal. "Speaking of investments," said a woman with blonde hair and diamonds that caught the light every time she moved her hands, "we just spent a fortune on a new piano teacher for little Christopher. The woman charges $300 an hour, but she trained at some fancy music school in Europe." $300 an hour? Laughed another guest. "That's more than my lawyer charges." "Well, you have to pay for quality," the blonde woman replied. "Christopher is performing at the youth concert series next month at the Symphony Hall. Only the most talented children get selected, and we want him to be ready." This sparked a wave of competitive parenting stories around the table. Private music lessons, exclusive summer camps, tutors who specialized in getting children into Ivy League schools. Margaret listened while she worked, amazed at how casually these people threw around amounts of money that could change her entire life. "Our daughter just got accepted to the advanced program at the conservatory," bragged a man with thick glasses and a perfectly trimmed beard. The audition process was incredibly competitive. Only 20 students out of hundreds who applied. Richard Blackwood leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Margaret had seen that look before. He was about to say something that would remind everyone that he was the most successful person at the table. "You know," Richard said, swirling his wine glass slowly, "all this talk about music reminds me that we have that beautiful Steinway in the salon." Cost me more than most people's houses, but it really does make a statement about appreciating the finer things in life. Oh, you have a Steinway? Asked the blonde woman with obvious envy. Those are incredible instruments. Does anyone in your family play? Richard chuckled and took a sip of his wine. Play? No. None of us have time for that sort of thing. I bought it because it looks impressive and shows people that we understand quality. Sometimes the appearance of culture is more valuable than culture itself, if you know what I mean. The guests laughed appreciatively, as if Richard had shared some brilliant insight about life. Margaret felt something twist in her stomach as she listened to him talk about the piano, like it was just another expensive decoration. It's sitting in our main salon right now, Richard continued, clearly enjoying the attention. Perfectly maintained, professionally tuned twice a year, worth more than most people make in a decade. But honestly, who has time to actually learn? To play these days? We're all too busy making real money. That's so practical, agreed another guest. Why spend years learning to play when you can just buy something beautiful and enjoy looking at it? Time is money, after all. Margaret moved to the sideboard to collect more empty plates, trying to keep her expression neutral. These people were talking about music like it was just another commodity to be bought and displayed. The idea that someone would own a Steinway piano and never touch the keys made her feel physically sick. The thing about really expensive instruments, Richard said, warming to his theme, is that they hold their value better than most investments. If I ever needed to sell it, I'd probably make money on the deal. Try doing that with piano lessons. More laughter around the table. Margaret noticed that Mrs. Blackwood was smiling and nodding along with her husband's comments, clearly proud of his practical approach to culture and art. As Margaret cleared the last of the appetizer plates, she caught fragments of other conversations. Stories about yacht clubs and private islands, complaints about how hard it was to find good help these days, discussions about which private schools had the best, connections for getting children into top universities. These people lived in a bubble where everything could be bought, where value was measured only in dollars, where a piano was just furniture and music was just noise. Margaret had spent her whole evening listening to them brag about their wealth while treating something she loved like it was meaningless decoration. She pushed through the swinging doors, back to the kitchen, her hands shaking slightly as she set down the tray of dirty plates. The catering manager looked at her with concern. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale. Margaret nodded quickly. I'm fine, just tired. It's been a long day. But she wasn't fine. Listening to Richard Blackwood dismiss the piano so casually, treating it like expensive furniture instead of the incredible instrument it was, had stirred up feelings she had been trying to bury for 3 years. She took a deep breath and picked up another tray. There was still a long evening ahead, and she needed this job. Whatever emotions Richard Blackwood's comments had awakened in her, she would have to deal with them later, in private, where they belonged. The dinner had moved from the formal dining room to the main salon, where the guests were now enjoying expensive cognac and continuing their conversations about money and success. Margaret had been cleaning up the dining room when Patricia, the catering manager, found her and asked her to serve drinks in the salon as well. Margaret really didn't want to go into that room. The salon was where the piano sat, and after listening to Richard Blackwood talk about it like it was just expensive furniture, she felt emotionally raw. But she needed this job, and refusing wasn't an option. She picked up a tray of crystal glasses filled with cognac that probably cost more per bottle than she made in a week. When she entered the salon, the guests were scattered around the elegant room, some sitting on the velvet sofas, others standing near the tall windows that looked out over the perfectly manicured gardens. The crystal chandelier cast warm light over everything, making the whole scene look like something from a magazine. about how rich people lived. Richard Blackwood was standing near the fireplace, holding court as usual. Margaret noticed he had loosened his tie, and his face was flushed from all the wine and cognac he had been drinking throughout the evening. His voice was louder than it had been at dinner, and his gestures were becoming more dramatic as he told stories about his business successes. "The thing about making real money," Richard was saying to a small group gathered around him, "is that you have to think bigger than everyone else. While other people are worried about small profits, I'm making deals that change entire industries." Margaret moved quietly around the room, offering drinks to guests who barely acknowledged her presence. She tried to stay as far away from the piano as possible, but the room's layout made that difficult. No matter where she went, that magnificent instrument seemed to draw her attention like a magnet. One of the guests, a woman with silver hair and pearls, was examining the piano more closely. "This really is a beautiful instrument, Richard," she called out. "The craftsmanship is extraordinary. It must sound wonderful when it's played." Richard laughed and walked over to where the woman was standing, his cognac glass sloshing slightly as he moved. "Well, as I mentioned at dinner, nobody in this house actually plays the thing. It's purely for show. Sometimes I think about having someone come in and play it for parties. You know, like background music, but honestly, most people don't really listen to classical music anyway." Margaret was refilling glasses at a side table nearby, trying to make herself invisible while she worked. But Richard's words were like knives cutting into her heart. The idea that someone would buy such a magnificent instrument and never let it sing was almost unbearable. "You know what's funny?" Richard continued, his voice getting louder as the alcohol loosened his tongue. "I've probably spent more on this piano than most people spend on their entire houses, and it just sits here looking pretty. That's the difference between people like us and regular working people. We can afford to buy beautiful things just because we can." The guests murmured their agreement, though Margaret noticed some of them looked slightly uncomfortable with how openly Richard was bragging about his wealth. But nobody said anything to challenge him. In groups like this, money talked loudest. Of all, Margaret finished with the side table and started to move toward the door, hoping to escape back to the kitchen. But as she passed near the piano, Richard's attention suddenly focused on her. She could see his eyes were glassy from drinking, and there was something in his expression that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "You know what?" Richard said, suddenly, his voice cutting through the conversations happening around the room. "Speaking of regular working people, we have our very own representative right here." Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She stopped walking and looked down at the tray in her hands, hoping that if she didn't make eye contact, Richard would lose interest and turn his attention to something else. But Richard was just getting started. The alcohol had loosened his inhibitions, and Margaret could see that dangerous look in his eyes that meant he was about to do something cruel for his own amusement. "Margaret here has been cleaning our house for months," Richard announced to the room, as if he was introducing some kind of curiosity for his guests to examine. "She works 3 different jobs, isn't that right, Margaret? 3 different houses, 3 different families, probably making in a whole year what some people in this room spend on a weekend vacation." Margaret felt her face burning with embarrassment. The guests were all staring at her now, some with curiosity, others with the kind of polite discomfort that rich people showed when forced to acknowledge that poor people actually existed. "Richard," Mrs. Blackwood said quietly from across the room, "perhaps we should let Margaret get back to her work." But Richard waved off his wife's suggestion with an impatient gesture. The alcohol had made him bold and mean, and Margaret could see that he was enjoying having an audience for whatever game he was planning to play. No, this is perfect," Richard said, walking closer to Margaret with an unsteady step. We were just talking about this beautiful piano and how nobody in the house plays it. Well, here's an idea. Why don't we have Margaret here give us a little performance? The suggestion hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Margaret felt her heart start racing, and she gripped the tray tighter to keep her hands from shaking. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing that their host was about to cross a line from rude into genuinely cruel. I don't think. That's a good idea, Mr. Blackwood, Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I should really get back to cleaning up the dining room. Nonsense, Richard declared, his voice booming across the salon. Come on, everyone, this will be entertaining. We have this incredibly expensive piano that never gets played. And here we have someone from the working class who can show us what they think music is supposed to sound like. Margaret took a step backward, clutching the tray like it was a shield. Really, Mr. Blackwood, I don't know how to play piano. I should just finish my work and let you enjoy your evening with your guests. But Richard was beyond listening to reason. The combination of alcohol and the audience of wealthy friends had brought out the worst in his personality. He was going to humiliate Margaret for sport, and nothing she said was going to stop him. Oh, come on, Richard said with a nasty smile. Don't be modest. I bet you've always wondered what it would be like to sit at a piano like this. Here's your chance to live like rich people for a few minutes. Some of the guests were looking down at their drinks or out the windows, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. But nobody spoke up to stop Richard. In their world, challenging your host's behavior simply wasn't done, especially when that host was as wealthy and influential as Richard Blackwood. Richard, really? Mrs. Blackwood tried again. I think Margaret has work to do. The work can wait, Richard snapped, his pleasant host mask slipping to reveal the cruel person underneath. This is my house, my piano, my staff, and if I want some entertainment, that's exactly what I'm going to get. Margaret realized with growing horror that there was no escape from this situation. Richard Blackwood had decided to humiliate her in front of his wealthy friends, and he had the power to make her life very difficult if she refused. She needed this job desperately. Without it, she and Isabella would lose their apartment. Just sit down at the piano, Richard commanded, pointing toward the bench with his cognac glass. Play us something simple. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or something else at your level. The guests watched in uncomfortable silence as Margaret slowly set down her tray on a nearby table. Her hands were trembling now, and she felt sick to her stomach. But she had no choice. She needed this job too much to risk losing it by defying Richard Blackwood in front of his important business associates. With slow, reluctant steps, Margaret walked toward the piano. Each step felt like walking toward her own execution. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room watching her, waiting to see how this cruel entertainment would play out. Richard followed behind her, still talking to his audience. This should be interesting, he said with a laugh that had no warmth in it. Let's see what our cleaning lady thinks she knows about music. Margaret reached the piano bench and stood there for a moment, staring down at the polished wood. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. Behind her, she could sense Richard's satisfied smile as he prepared to enjoy watching her fail and embarrass herself. She had no idea that in just a few moments, everything in that room was about to change forever. Margaret stood in front of the piano bench, her whole body trembling. The beautiful black and white keys seemed to mock her from beneath the polished lid. She could feel Richard Blackwood standing behind her, practically radiating satisfaction at the entertainment he was about to provide for his wealthy guests. Go ahead, Richard said with a cruel smile in his voice. Don't be shy. We're all friends here. Just sit down and play us something nice and simple. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to hide it. The last thing she wanted was to give Richard even more reason to laugh at her. She slowly lowered herself onto the piano bench, the expensive leather cushion soft beneath her. When was the last time she had sat at a piano bench? 3 years? It felt like a lifetime ago. "That's it," Richard continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Make yourself comfortable. Pretend you belong there." The comment sent a sharp pain through Margaret's chest. Pretend you belong there. If only he knew how naturally she had once belonged at a piano bench, how many hours she had spent practicing and performing, how music had once been as essential to her as breathing. Behind her, she could hear some of the guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A few were whispering quietly to each other, probably wondering if their host had gone too far this time. But nobody spoke up loud enough for Richard to hear. In this world of wealth and power, nobody wanted to risk offending someone as influential as Richard Blackwood. "You know what I think would be perfect?" Richard announced to the room, his voice getting louder and more theatrical. "Something really basic. Maybe Mary had a little lamb or chopsticks. Something that matches the skill level we're dealing with here." A nervous laugh rippled through some of the guests. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out Richard's voice and the feeling of all those eyes staring at her. She needed to get through this somehow, play a few simple notes, let Richard have his cruel laugh, and then escape back to the kitchen where she could finish her work in peace. "Actually," Richard continued, warming to his theme, "this is really quite educational for all of us. Here we are, people who understand true culture and refinement, and we get to see what happens when someone from the working class tries to pretend they know anything about classical music." Margaret felt her face burning with shame and anger. The way Richard was talking about her, like she was some kind of zoo animal performing tricks for his amusement, made her stomach turn, but she bit her tongue and said nothing. She needed this job too desperately to fight back. No matter how much his words hurt, Mrs. Blackwood spoke up from across the room, her voice tight with embarrassment. "Richard, perhaps this isn't necessary. I'm sure Margaret would rather just finish her work." "Nonsense, dear," Richard replied, waving off his wife's concern. "This is the most interesting thing that's happened at one of our dinner parties in months. Besides, I'm sure Margaret appreciates the opportunity to experience what it's like to sit at a real piano. Most people in her position never get a chance like this." Margaret stared down at the keys, fighting back tears. Each of Richard's comments felt like a slap across the face. He was treating her like she should be grateful for his cruelty, like being humiliated in front of his wealthy friends was some kind of gift he was giving her. "The truth is," Richard continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "there's a real difference between people who can afford to appreciate fine things and people who can only pretend to understand them. This piano represents centuries of musical tradition and craftsmanship. It's not something you can just sit down and play without years of proper training and education." One of the male guests cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Richard, maybe we should move on to the library for cigars. I think Margaret probably needs to get back to her duties." But Richard was too caught up in his own performance to listen. The alcohol had made him bold and mean, and having an audience of important people made him feel powerful. He was enjoying this too much to stop now. No, I think this is important," Richard insisted. "It's a learning experience for everyone. We get to see the difference between real culture and—" He gestured dismissively toward Margaret. "Whatever this is supposed to be." Margaret's hands hovered over the keys, still trembling. She knew she had to play something, anything, just to get this nightmare over with. Maybe if she hit a few random notes, Richard would be satisfied with his cruelty and let her leave. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the room. "Take your time," Richard said with fake kindness. "I know this must be overwhelming for you." Being in the presence of such an expensive instrument, surrounded by people who actually understand quality and refinement. It's probably more luxury than you've ever experienced in your entire life. The condescension in his voice was so thick. It was almost choking. Margaret could hear some of the guests murmuring quietly among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with how far their host was pushing this humiliation. But still, nobody had the courage to tell Richard to stop. Margaret tried. To think of something simple she could play. Maybe just a basic scale or a few notes of a children's song like Richard had suggested. Something that would end this torture quickly, so she could escape back to the safety of the kitchen. But as her fingers got closer to the keys, something strange happened. Muscle memory that had been buried for 3 years began to stir. Her hands, despite their trembling, seemed to remember their proper position. Her fingers naturally curved into the shape they had learned through thousands of hours of practice. "This is taking quite a while," Richard commented with amusement. "I suppose. Even playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star requires some concentration when you're not used to real instruments." Margaret closed her eyes and tried to push away the memories that Richard's cruelty was awakening. She thought about Isabella, waiting at home for her to return from work. She thought about the rent that was due next week, the groceries they needed, the electric bill that couldn't wait much longer. She needed this job. She had to endure whatever humiliation Richard wanted to dish out. "You know what?" Richard said, his voice getting even more theatrical. "Maybe we're being too ambitious. Margaret, why don't you just press a few keys randomly? We'll call it modern art or something. That way, even if it sounds terrible, we can pretend it's supposed to be that way." The guest's discomfort was becoming more obvious now. Several people were staring down at their drinks or looking out the windows, clearly wishing this whole scene would end. But Richard was too intoxicated with his own power to notice or care about their discomfort. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at the keys again. They were beautiful, each one perfectly positioned and gleaming in the chandelier's light. For just a moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like when music flowed through her fingers, when she and the piano worked together to create something magical. But those days were gone. That life was over. Now she was just a cleaning lady who needed to survive whatever cruelty Richard Blackwood wanted to throw at her. She took a deep breath and slowly reached toward the keys. Behind her, Richard was still talking, still making jokes at her expense for the entertainment of his wealthy friends. She could feel their eyes on her back, waiting to see how this cruel entertainment would play out. Margaret's fingers touched the keys for the first time in 3 years. The smooth ivory felt cool and familiar beneath her fingertips, like greeting an old friend she thought she would never see again. Richard was saying something else behind her, probably another insult disguised as humor. But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. For the first time since this nightmare began, her mind went quiet. All the fear and anger and humiliation faded into the background. Her fingers found their positions on the keys as if no time had passed at all. And then, without really deciding to do it, Margaret began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were nothing like what anyone in the room expected. Instead of the fumbling, uncertain sounds of someone who had never touched a piano before, the music that filled the salon was pure, confident, and breathtakingly beautiful. Margaret's fingers moved across the keys with the kind of precision that only came from years of intensive training. She wasn't playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or Chopsticks like Richard had mockingly suggested. Instead, she had begun one of the most challenging pieces in classical piano literature, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu. The complex, rapid-fire notes cascaded from the piano like water flowing over stones. Margaret's hands danced across the keyboard with a grace and confidence that seemed impossible. Her left hand played a steady, powerful rhythm while her right hand wove an intricate melody that seemed to float above it like magic. Richard Blackwood's mocking laughter died in his throat. His mouth fell open as he stared at Margaret's hands moving with professional skill across the keys of his expensive piano. This was not what was supposed to happen. This was not the humiliating entertainment he had planned for his guests. The guests around the room had fallen completely silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Cognac glasses were forgotten, and all eyes focused on the woman in the simple gray uniform who was producing music that belonged in the world's greatest concert halls. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been trying to stop her husband's cruel game, now stood frozen by the fireplace, her hand pressed to her chest. She had hosted dozens of dinner parties in this room, but she had never heard the Steinways sing like this. The piano seemed to come alive under Margaret's touch, its voice filling every corner of the salon with pure crystalline sound. Margaret herself felt like she was in a dream. Her fingers remembered every note, every subtle timing, every delicate touch that the piece required. It was as if the last 3 years of cleaning houses and struggling to survive had never happened. For these precious moments, she was exactly where she belonged, at a piano, creating beauty from silence. The music grew more complex as Margaret moved into the most challenging section of the piece. Her hands crossed over each other in impossible patterns, playing notes so fast they almost blurred together. But every single note was perfect, crystal clear, and filled with a kind of emotion that could only come from someone who truly understood what they were playing. One of the guests, an elderly man with silver hair who had been silent most of the evening, slowly set down his cognac glass and leaned forward in his chair. There were tears forming in his eyes as he listened to Margaret play. He recognized the piece, and he knew exactly how difficult it was. What he was witnessing was nothing short of miraculous. Richard stood behind the piano bench, his face cycling through emotions like a broken television. Confusion gave way to shock, shock gave way to anger, and anger gave way to a kind of panicked disbelief. This was his cleaning lady, his employee, someone he paid to dust his furniture and clean his toilets. She wasn't supposed to be capable of this. The music continued to flow from off Margaret's fingers like it was the most natural thing in the world. She had moved seamlessly from the opening section into the hauntingly beautiful middle passage, where the melody became slower and more lyrical. Her touch on the keys was so gentle and controlled that each note seemed to hang in the air for exactly the right amount of time before dissolving into the next. Several of the women in the room had tears streaming down their faces. They had spent the entire evening talking about their children's expensive music lessons and exclusive performances, but none of them had ever heard anything like what Margaret was playing. This wasn't just technical skill, this was artistry. At its highest level, Margaret's eyes were closed now, completely lost in the music. Her whole body swayed slightly with the rhythm, and her face had transformed from the mask of fear and humiliation she had worn just minutes before. Now she looked peaceful, powerful, and absolutely radiant. This was who she really was. Underneath the simple uniform and the exhaustion of working 3 jobs. As the piece built toward its dramatic conclusion, Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard with increasing speed and intensity. The music grew louder and more passionate, filling the room with sound that seemed to make the crystal chandelier vibrate in sympathy. Every person in the salon could feel the music in their chest, in their bones, in their very souls. Richard tried to speak, to say something that would interrupt this impossible performance and restore his control over the situation, but no words came out. He stood there with his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, completely unable to process what he was witnessing. The blonde woman who had been bragging about her son's expensive piano lessons was crying openly now. She understood enough about music to know that what Margaret was playing was far beyond anything her child would ever achieve, despite all the money she had spent on his education. This was the kind of talent that couldn't be bought or taught. It was a gift that some people were born with. Margaret reached the final section of the piece, where the opening melody returned, but with even more complexity and power. Her fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur, but every note rang out clear and perfect. The music built to an incredible crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house, and then, with a final, thunderous chord that seemed to hang in the air forever, the music stopped. The silence that followed was so complete it was almost painful. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The only sound in the entire salon was the faint echo of the final chord slowly fading away. Margaret sat at the piano bench with her hands still resting on the keys, her eyes still closed, her breathing slow and deep. For a few precious moments, she had been home again. She had been herself again. She had been the pianist she was always meant to be. Slowly she opened her eyes and turned around to face the room. The faces staring back at her were completely different from the ones that had been watching her with amusement and superiority just minutes before. Now they looked at her with awe, with respect, and with something that might have been shame. The elderly man with silver hair was the first to move. He stood up slowly from his chair, his legs unsteady with emotion, and began to clap. The sound of his applause seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. And suddenly everyone was standing, everyone was clapping. And several people were wiping tears from their eyes. Richard Blackwood remained frozen behind the piano, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. His cruel entertainment had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. Instead of humiliating Margaret, he had revealed her to be more talented and cultured than anyone else in the room, himself included. Margaret stood up from the piano bench and smoothed down her simple gray uniform. The applause continued around her, but she felt strangely calm and detached from it all. She had done what she needed to do. She had played the music that was always inside her, waiting to be released. She looked directly at Richard for the first time since this whole ordeal began. His mouth was still hanging open, and he looked like he had been hit by lightning. She could see in his eyes that he finally understood he had made a terrible mistake. "Thank you," Margaret said quietly to the room in general. "I should get back to my work now." And with that simple statement, she walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of wealthy people who would never think about cleaning ladies or music or the hidden talents of ordinary people in quite the same way ever again. Margaret had almost reached the salon doors when a voice stopped her. It was the elderly man with silver hair who had been the first to stand and applaud. His voice was gentle but firm, filled with genuine respect. "Please, wait," he said, stepping forward slightly. "I have to ask, where did you learn to play like that?" Margaret paused with her hand on the door handle. She had hoped to escape quietly, to return to the safety of the kitchen where she could process what had just happened. But she could feel every person in the room waiting for her answer, their earlier dismissal replaced by intense curiosity and something that looked like shame. "I really should finish my work," Margaret said quietly, not turning around. "The dining room still needs to be cleaned, and the kitchen staff will be wondering where I am." "The work can wait," said the blonde woman who had been crying during the performance. Her voice was completely different now, no longer the confident bragging tone she had used at dinner. "Please, we would very much like to know." That was the most beautiful piano playing I've ever heard in my life. Richard Blackwood was still standing by the piano, looking like he had been hit by a truck. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly as he gripped his cognac glass. The cruel entertainment he had planned had backfired so completely that he seemed unable to speak or even move properly. Margaret slowly turned back to face the room. She could see the genuine curiosity in their faces, but also something else. Several of the guests looked embarrassed, ashamed of how they had been prepared to laugh at her humiliation just minutes before. The dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that it felt like an entirely different gathering. "I studied at Juilliard," Margaret said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed this statement was deafening. Juilliard was one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Getting accepted there required not just talent, but extraordinary talent. The kind of talent that these wealthy people had been paying thousands of dollars trying to nurture in their own children. "Juilliard?" repeated the silver-haired man, his voice filled with awe. "You graduated from Juilliard School of Music?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Class of 2018. I had a full scholarship for both undergraduate and graduate programs." The guests looked at each other with expressions of shock and growing shame. This woman they had been treating as invisible furniture. This person Richard had just tried to humiliate for their entertainment was more accomplished in her field than any of them. "We're in there's dot," Mrs. Blackwood spoke up from near the fireplace, her voice trembling slightly. "But then ... what are you doing? I mean, how are you ... She couldn't finish the question, but everyone understood what she was asking. Margaret looked down at her simple gray uniform, then back up at the room full of people in expensive clothes, who were now hanging on her every word. For 3 years, she had kept her past buried, telling no one about who she used to be. But something about tonight, about Richard's cruelty and her own performance, had broken down the walls she had built around those memories. "My husband got sick," she said, her voice steady but filled with old pain. "Cancer. The treatments went on for 2 years. Even with insurance, the medical bills were—" She paused, searching for words that could explain the financial nightmare that had destroyed her life. Everything we had saved, everything we owned, it all went to keeping him alive. The room was so quiet that Margaret could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway outside. Several of the women had tears in their eyes again, but these were different tears from the ones shed during her performance. These were tears of shame and sympathy. "I had to stop performing to take care of him," Margaret continued. "Missed auditions, canceled concerts, turned down opportunities. By the time he passed away 3 years ago, I had lost my place in the music world. No recent performances, no current connections, no way back in." The blonde woman who had been bragging about her son's expensive lessons was crying openly now. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "We had no idea." "I sold my piano to pay for his funeral," Margaret said, the words coming out like they had been waiting 3 years to be spoken. "It was a beautiful Yamaha baby grand that my parents bought me when I graduated. I loved that piano almost as much as I loved him." Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say anything about your background when you applied for the job?" Margaret looked at him with an expression that was neither angry nor bitter, just incredibly tired. "Would it have mattered, Mr. Blackwood? Would you have treated me differently if you knew I had a music degree? Or would you have just found it amusing that someone with my education was reduced to cleaning your toilets?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Several guests looked down at their drinks, unable to meet Margaret's eyes. They all knew the answer to her question, and it wasn't a comfortable truth. "I have a daughter," Margaret continued, "Isabella. She's 17 and wants to study medicine. Every dollar I make goes toward keeping us in our apartment and saving for her college tuition. When you need to survive, pride becomes a luxury you can't afford." The elderly man stepped forward again. "What you played tonight, that was Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu. It's one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire." "I should know. I'm on the board of the Metropolitan Opera." Margaret nodded. "It was always one of my favorites." My professor at Juilliard said I had a special gift for Chopin. I used to dream of recording his complete works someday. And you could have, the man said with conviction. What I heard tonight, that wasn't just technical skill. That was artistry. That was the kind of talent that sells out concert halls. Mrs. Blackwood walked over to where Margaret was standing. I owe you an apology, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We all do. The way we've treated you, the way my husband. She glanced back at Richard with disgust. It was inexcusable. You don't need to apologize, Mrs. Blackwood, Margaret said quietly. I understand how this world works. I used to move in similar circles before life changed everything. The blonde woman spoke up again, her voice urgent with excitement. But you could move in those circles again. With talent like yours, there have to be opportunities. My husband knows people in the music industry. We could make some calls, set up some meetings. My daughter takes piano lessons with the most expensive teacher in the city, said another guest, a well-dressed woman with kind eyes. But after hearing you play tonight, I think you could teach her more in one lesson than he has in a year. Would you consider giving private lessons? I would pay you whatever you asked. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how these people were treating her. An hour ago, she had been invisible furniture to them. Now they were treating her like a respected colleague, offering opportunities and showing genuine interest in her welfare. I appreciate the offers, Margaret said carefully, but I have to be realistic about my situation. I need steady work, reliable income. Teaching a few piano lessons here, and there wouldn't be enough to support my daughter and myself. What if it wasn't just a few lessons here and there? Asked the silver-haired man. What if we could help you build a real teaching practice? Between all of us, we know dozens of families who would pay handsomely for instruction from a Juilliard graduate. Richard was still standing by the piano, looking smaller and more deflated with each passing minute. His attempt to humiliate Margaret had not only failed spectacularly, but had also revealed his own character to his business associates in the worst possible light. These were people he needed to impress, people whose respect was crucial to his continued success, and he had just shown them exactly what kind of person he really was. There's something else, said the elderly man, his voice growing more excited. Next month, there's a charity concert at the Symphony Hall. It's a fundraiser for music education in public schools. They're always looking for talented performers, especially ones with inspiring personal stories. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, hope. Not just the desperate hope of making it through another month, but real hope for a different kind of future. The possibility that she might be able to use her talents again to be the musician she had trained so hard to become. I don't know, she said, her voice uncertain. It's been 3 years since I performed for an audience. I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that. After what we just witnessed, the man said with a smile, I think you're more ready than you realize. That performance was flawless. If you can play like that in a room full of strangers after being put on the spot, imagine what you could do on a real stage with time to prepare. Margaret looked around the room at all these wealthy, powerful people who were now looking at her with respect and genuine interest. The transformation was so complete that it felt surreal. But underneath her amazement, she felt something else. Growing, a quiet confidence that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The elderly man with silver hair, who had introduced himself as Dr. Harrison from the Metropolitan Opera Board, pulled out his phone right there in the salon. I'm calling Victoria Chun, he announced to the room. She's organizing the charity concert next month. If I can get her on the phone tonight, we might be able to arrange an audition for you this week. Margaret felt dizzy with how quickly things were moving. 20 minutes ago, she had been facing humiliation and possibly losing her job. Now these powerful people were making phone calls on her behalf and talking about auditions at symphony halls. "Dr. Harrison, that's very kind, but I really don't think," Margaret began, but the blonde woman interrupted her. "No, please don't." "Say no yet," the woman said urgently. "I'm Catherine Wells, and my husband owns 3 music venues in the city. When I tell him what we witnessed tonight, he'll want to meet with you immediately." She was already typing rapidly on her phone. "I'm sending him a message right now." Mrs. Blackwood approached Margaret with a look of determination. "And I'm calling my friend who runs the music program at the private academy downtown. They've been looking for a new piano instructor for months. With your credentials and talent, they would hire you in a heartbeat." Margaret looked around the room in amazement. These were the same people who had been ignoring her existence an hour ago, treating her like she was invisible furniture. Now, they were competing with each other to offer her opportunities that could change her entire life. Richard Blackwood, meanwhile, had moved to the far corner of the room and was nursing his cognac with a dark expression. He could see exactly what was happening. His attempt to humiliate Margaret had backfired so spectacularly that she was now the center of attention and respect from his most important business associates. Worse, his cruel behavior had been witnessed by people whose opinions could seriously damage his reputation. Dr. Harrison finished his phone call and walked back over to Margaret with excitement. "Victoria is still at her office. She's agreed to meet with you tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock at the Symphony Hall. She wants to hear you play in person." "Tomorrow?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. "But I don't have anything prepared. I haven't performed in 3 years. I don't even have proper clothes for an audition." Catherine Wells looked up from her phone. "Don't worry about clothes. We're about the same size, and I have closets full of appropriate concert attire. As for preparation, after what we just heard, I don't think you need to worry about that either." Another guest, a distinguished man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "I'm Robert Chun, Victoria's husband, actually. I run a talent management company. If tomorrow's audition goes well, and I have no doubt it will, I'd like to discuss representation with you. There are opportunities in this city for someone with your level of talent." Margaret felt like she was living in some kind of dream. These offers were beyond anything she had dared to hope for during the dark years since her husband's death. But part of her was afraid to believe it was real, afraid that she would wake up and find herself back in the kitchen, cleaning dishes, and trying to stay invisible. The woman with kind eyes who had mentioned piano lessons for her daughter came over with a business card. "I'm Linda Morrison. Even if all these other opportunities work out, I would still love for you to teach my daughter. She's been taking lessons for 4 years, but I can see now that her current teacher doesn't have your level of skill or understanding." "How much are you paying her current teacher?" asked Catherine Wells curiously. $200 an hour, Linda replied. "And honestly, after tonight, I realize we haven't been getting our money's worth." Margaret's eyes widened. $200 an hour was more than she made in an entire day of cleaning houses. If she could get just a few students at that rate, she could quit her cleaning jobs and focus entirely on music again. Dr. Harrison overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly. "That's actually on the low end for a Juilliard graduate with your level of skill. In Manhattan, teachers with your credentials charge $300 to $400 per hour." $300 to $400? Margaret repeated, hardly believing what she was hearing. At those rates, she would only need a handful of students to make more money than all 3 of her cleaning jobs combined. While these conversations were happening, Richard was becoming increasingly agitated in his corner. He could see his carefully planned evening turning into a social disaster. The people he had invited to impress with his wealth and power were now more interested in helping his cleaning lady than in doing business with him. Robert Chun was still talking to Margaret about representation when his phone buzzed. He looked at the message and smiled. My assistant just reminded me. We have a client who's looking for a piano teacher for her twin boys. She's been complaining for months that she can't find anyone good enough. She pays $500 an hour and provides a car service to and from lessons. Margaret felt her knees go weak. $500 an hour? That was more money than she currently made in an entire week. With just a few students at those rates, she could not only support herself and Isabella comfortably, but actually start saving money for Isabella's college education. Catherine Wells was still on her phone, making call after call. I've already lined up 3 potential students for you, she announced. All of them are wealthy families who are willing to pay premium rates for quality instruction. And my husband wants to discuss having you perform at his venues. He thinks you could be perfect for his classical music series. Mrs. Blackwood returned from her own phone call with good news. The Academy is very interested. They want to interview you this Thursday. The position pays $80,000 a year plus benefits, and it's only part-time, so you could still take private students on the side. Margaret sat down heavily in one of the velvet chairs, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation in her prospects. $80,000 a year was more than she had made from all 3 cleaning jobs combined, and that was just the base salary before private lessons. Richard finally spoke up from his corner, his voice bitter and angry. "This is all very touching," he said with a sneer, "but let's be realistic here. She's been out of the music world for 3 years. Do you really think she can just walk back into concert halls and prestigious teaching positions like nothing happened?" The room fell silent, and every person turned to look at Richard with expressions of disgust. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his voice cold and authoritative. "Mr. Blackwood," he said carefully, "I've been in the music world for 40 years. What I heard tonight was not someone who's been away from music for 3 years. That was someone who's been carrying music inside them every single day, waiting for the chance to let it out again." Catherine Wells looked at Richard with open contempt. "And frankly, Richard, after the way you treated Margaret tonight, your opinion on her prospects is completely irrelevant. What you did was cruel and inexcusable." Other guests began nodding in agreement, and Margaret could see Richard's face growing red with anger and embarrassment. He was beginning to realize that his behavior tonight wasn't just going to be forgotten or forgiven by his important business associates. "I think," said Robert Chin quietly, "that perhaps it's time for us to leave. Margaret, would you like us to give you a ride home? We have several cars outside, and I'd like to discuss the audition tomorrow on the way." Margaret looked around the room at all these people who had gone from treating her like invisible help to offering her opportunities that could transform her life. She thought about Isabella waiting at home, about the rent that was due next week, about the dream she had buried 3 years ago when her world fell apart. "Yes," she said, standing up with more confidence than she had felt in years. "I would like that very much." As the guests began gathering their coats and preparing to leave, Margaret noticed that several of them were deliberately avoiding eye contact with Richard. The man who had started the evening as the powerful host commanding everyone's attention was now being treated like he had some kind of contagious disease. Mrs. Blackwood approached Margaret one more time before she left. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that you don't need to come back here to work, ever. What my husband did tonight was unforgivable, and I won't have you subjected to that kind of treatment again." Margaret nodded gratefully. She had been wondering how she could face coming back to clean this house after everything that had happened. Now she realized she might never have to clean another house again. As she walked toward the door with Dr. Harrison and the other guests, Margaret turned back one last time to look at the piano. The beautiful Steinway sat silent again, its lid closed, but Margaret knew that something fundamental had changed. The piano had found its voice tonight, and so had she. Richard stood alone in his salon, surrounded by empty cognac glasses and the lingering echo of the most beautiful music his expensive piano had ever produced. He had wanted to humiliate someone for his own entertainment, but instead he had revealed his own character to the people whose respect he needed most. And Margaret Rodriguez, the cleaning lady he had tried to destroy, was walking out his front door toward a future brighter than anything she had dared to dream. 3 months later, Margaret stood backstage at Symphony Hall, wearing an elegant black concert dress that Catherine Wells had insisted on buying for her. Her hands were calm as she prepared for her third solo performance since that fateful night at the Blackwood Mansion. The charity concert that Dr. Harrison had arranged had been such a success that other venues started calling immediately. Margaret could hear the murmur of the sold-out audience through the heavy curtains. It still amazed her that people were buying tickets specifically to hear her play. After 3 years of being invisible, of cleaning other people's houses and keeping her head down, she was now the featured performer at one of the city's most prestigious venues. Isabella sat in the front row, wearing a new dress and beaming with pride. At 17, she had watched her mother transform from exhausted cleaning lady to celebrated pianist in just a few months. The college acceptance letters had started arriving last week, and thanks to Margaret's new income, they could afford to send Isabella to any school she chose. 5 minutes, Miss Rodriguez, the stage manager whispered. Margaret nodded and took a deep breath. She thought back to that night when Richard Blackwood had tried to humiliate her in front of his wealthy friends. He had meant to break her down, to use her as entertainment for his cruel amusement. Instead, he had accidentally given her back her life. The teaching had started immediately. Within a week of that dinner party, Margaret had 12 private students, all paying between $300 and $500 per hour. Linda Morrison's daughter had made more progress in 2 weeks with Margaret than she had in 4 years with her previous teacher. Word spread quickly among the wealthy families of the city that there was a new piano teacher who was worth any price. The academy position had materialized exactly as Mrs. Blackwood had promised. Margaret now taught advanced piano 3 days a week to the most talented students in the city's most exclusive private school. The salary was more money than she had ever dreamed of making, and the students were eager and respectful in a way that reminded her why she had fallen in love with teaching in the first place, but it was the performance opportunities that had truly brought Margaret back to life. Robert Chun had been true to his word about representation. Within a month, he had booked her for solo recitals at venues throughout the city. The reviews in the newspapers were glowing, with critics calling her playing transcendent and a revelation. Places, Miss Rodriguez, the stage manager announced. Margaret walked to the wings and peeked out at the audience. The hall was completely full, 1,500 people who had paid to hear her play. In the VIP section, she could see several familiar faces from that night at the Blackwoods. Dr. Harrison was there with his wife. Catherine and Robert Chun were sitting together, and Linda Morrison had brought her entire family. What made Margaret smile, though, was seeing the group of children in the middle section. These were students from her newest project, a music school she had opened in a converted warehouse on the south side of the city. The school provided free piano lessons to children whose families couldn't afford private instruction. Margaret funded it entirely from her teaching income, and it had already grown to serve over 50 students. The idea had come to her 6 weeks after that transformative night. She had been earning more money than she had ever imagined possible, but she kept thinking about all the children who would never get the chance to discover their musical talents simply because their families couldn't afford lessons. She decided to change that, one student at a time. Margaret walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The spotlight was warm on her face as she sat down at the beautiful Steinway Concert Grand. This piano was even more magnificent than the one in Richard Blackwood's salon, and unlike that instrument, this one was used for its intended purpose every single day. She began with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same composer whose Fantaisie Impromptu had changed her life 3 months ago. Her fingers found the keys with perfect confidence, and the music that filled the hall was even more beautiful than what she had played that night. Months of regular practice and performance had sharpened her skills to an even higher level. As she played, Margaret thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The years of struggle after her husband's death, the exhaustion of working 3 cleaning jobs, the humiliation of being treated as invisible by people like Richard Blackwood. All of it had led to this, to her rightful place on a concert stage, sharing her gift with people who truly appreciated it. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Blackwood sat alone in his mansion, which now felt more like a prison than a palace. The last 3 months had been a nightmare for him. Word of his cruel behavior at the dinner party had spread quickly through his social and business circles. 3 major deals had fallen through when his potential partners decided they didn't want to work with someone who treated people so badly. The story had even made it into the society pages of the newspaper, though not in the way Richard would have wanted. The headline read, "From cleaning lady to concert hall, local pianist's remarkable journey," and the article included several quotes from dinner party guests describing Richard's shocking cruelty and Margaret's extraordinary grace. Under pressure, his wife had moved out 2 weeks after the dinner party, telling him that she was ashamed to be married to someone who could be so heartless. Several of his closest friends had stopped returning his calls, and he had been quietly asked to resign from 2 charity boards. The social consequences of that one night of cruelty were following him everywhere he went. Richard had tried to contact Margaret several times, though he wasn't sure what he wanted to say to her. His calls went unanswered, and when he attempted to send flowers to her apartment, they were returned unopened. Margaret had made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with him, and he couldn't blame her. Back at Symphony Hall, Margaret had finished the Chopin and moved on to a piece by Rachmaninoff that showcased her incredible technical abilities. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every note. This was the kind of respectful attention that Margaret had dreamed of during her years at Juilliard, and she had finally found her way back to it. When she finished her formal program, the audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. Margaret stood and bowed gracefully, then sat back down at the piano for her encore. She had chosen a simple, beautiful piece by Debussy that she often played for her young students at the free music school. As she played, Margaret looked out at the children in the audience who were there because of her scholarship program. Their faces were shining with wonder and inspiration. Several of them had told her that hearing her story had made them believe that anything was possible, that talent and hard work could overcome any obstacle. After the concert, Margaret was surrounded by well-wishers and new fans. Record companies had started approaching her about recording contracts, and there was talk of a concert tour that would take her to major cities across the country. The opportunities seemed endless, and Margaret was amazed daily by how much her life had changed. Dr. Harrison approached her during the reception after the concert. "Margaret," he said with a warm smile, "I have some news that might interest you. The Metropolitan Opera is planning a special gala performance next spring. They would like you to be one of the featured performers." Margaret's eyes widened. The Metropolitan Opera was one of the most prestigious venues in the world. Performing there would officially mark her return to the highest levels of the classical music world. "I would be honored," she said, meaning every word. As the evening wound down and the last of the well-wishers finally left, Margaret found herself alone on the empty stage with the concert piano. She sat down and played a few soft notes, marveling at how different her life was now compared to 3 months ago. She thought about Richard Blackwood, sitting alone in his mansion with his expensive piano that never sang. His attempt to humiliate her had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. He had meant to show her that she didn't belong in his world of wealth and culture. Instead, he had accidentally proven that she belonged in a much more important world, the world of true artistry and genuine achievement. Margaret stood up from the piano and gathered her music. Tomorrow she would teach her advanced students at the academy, work with her private pupils, and spend the evening at her free music school helping children discover the magic of music. It was a full life, a meaningful life, and a life that honored the gift she had been given. As she walked off the stage for the final time that evening, Margaret smiled to herself. She had learned that sometimes the worst moments in life could unexpectedly become doorways to the best moments. Richard Blackwood's cruelty had been meant to break her, but instead had shown her the way back to who she was always meant to be. The piano in Richard's salon still sat silent and unused, a beautiful instrument reduced to expensive decoration. But Margaret's music now filled concert halls and brought joy to hundreds of students. She had proven that talent and dignity could never truly be taken away. They could only be temporarily hidden, waiting for the right moment to shine again. And shine she had, brighter than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible.